who've never been on a CCO health call, maybe just put where you are and what you do in your name in your chat. It's nice to see a good crowd here tonight, and we are recording it for several people that said they couldn't make it tonight. So Megan Wolff is a public health expert. She has an MPH. She's done a lot of work on plastics. She actually teaches an entire 3-hour course on plastics and human health at Bennington College. And she recently started a nonprofit for a speakers bureau, which you'll probably talk about, on plastics. And so she actually gave a 12-hour course on plastics to a bunch of us in healthcare just over the last couple months. And amazingly, she's able to condense that down to a 40-minute talk. So we're going to give her all the time that we can here. And I think you all will enjoy it.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Lori. I can talk forever, so I will try to talk for fewer than 3 hours at a time right now. And I will tell you a little bit more about the course in case people are interested. It's actually about to be offered again through Bennington College, since I am visiting faculty there, so it's online. So I'll tell you all about that at the end. But as Lori said, yep, I have an MPH. I actually also have a doctorate in public health, which is handy because it means that legislators sort of sit up and take a little bit more notice when I go and visit and try to make some points, and that can be useful. And what Lori was just saying about the nonprofit that I'm launching is about teaching people to speak on plastics and health. And specifically, if you are a healthcare professional, your voice is very loud in this space. Also, if you happen to be a child, but I don't see very many children on this call, and it can be harder to get past their parents to mobilize. So anyway, that's me. The new organization is called the Physicians and Scientists Network for Advocacy on Plastics and Health, which is a really boring mouthful, but everyone seems to like that it shortens to PSNAP.
Yeah.
So there you go. So today I want to give you a little bit of background on the problem and what the problem does in climate and health. And before I do that, I just want to give this proviso. I actually initially trained as a historian, as a medical historian. And one of the first things that you get as you're studying history formally is that history is not inevitable. People make history, and the decisions of individuals in context matter. I studied history to inform policy with the idea that if we were going to change or recreate policy, we should know how we got to where we are and that it wasn't inevitable. And as you're looking at where people zigged or zagged, you can think about how to unzig or unzag. Problems that are not inevitable are solvable. And with climate, and especially with plastics, the problem is so recent on a historical scale that we can take a look at how it got here and often discover that the people, and they were specific people and specific organizations, those who made those decisions that got us to where we are today. We need some muting. Steve? No. Okay. Everyone mute, please. I think, all right, excellent, thank you. In any case, the people who got us to where we are today, the decisions that were made, you can actually often identify them. And in this case, they may still be at work in the original offices that they were in when they made those decisions. That makes this problem solvable, very solvable, because it just started. And that gives me a lot of hope. So what you're going to hear this evening can be a real downer. I've got a lot of buzzkill information, but I approach it with hope. I wouldn't be in this fight if I didn't think we could win. I'm not quite enough of a self-hating person to get into a fight that I don't think that we can lick. So that said, what is the problem? Well, on the face of it, it's a volume problem. We've managed to produce nearly 10 billion tons of plastic since 1950, almost all of which is still with us in some form. Plastic is incredibly durable. It's a synthetic product. Carbon-carbon bonds, they do not biodegrade. In fact, there's debate among scientists about whether they even ever demineralize and go back to their component parts. So plastic, unless it's been incinerated, is still here. And there are very few plastic pollution deniers. Most people walk out of their houses and they see it everywhere. So at first, it looks like a litter problem, which can be written off as a nuisance. disturbs many people, but theoretically, it's a nuisance. Toxicologists always knew differently, and over the last 3 or 4 years, as a collective society, we've started to understand differently too. And I'll talk about how we got there. But here's one more ray of odd hope. It's hope and darkness at the same time. That massive production of plastic had barely begun by 1955, and it ramped up fast. It ramped up so fast and so recently that more than half of all plastic in existence today has been created since the year 2000. FYI, a lot of that has to do with American energy production, because many of the single-use plastics are actually made out of ethylene, which comes from ethane, which is a fracked gas. So we have a glut of that on the market, and it's being used to produce a lot of plastic. So that's 2000 to a little past the present moment. But this pink part of the curve is what industry is projecting that its growth will be. Industry is planning to triple the curve of plastic by 2060. And we know that the plastic to waste ratio is 1 to 1. The more plastic that gets created, the more plastic pollution we have. Okay, well, it's not going to biodegrade. So what actually happens to it? This is where people have begun taking notice on a kind of society-wide schedule just in the last few years. Plastics don't break down in the environment. They break up instead into smaller and smaller fragments. And if you've ever left anything as simple as a child's toy in the backyard over the summer and a winter and a season, you see it gets brittle, it cracks, and then the longer it's out there, the more fragmented it becomes as the UV rays work on it and the time and the wind and so on. So it breaks down into microplastics, which was one of the New York Times words of the year, I think, in about 2023, 2022. It was a new word then for most of us. We didn't realize, though, that it doesn't stop at microplastics, or at least most of us didn't realize that. It keeps on going into smaller and smaller and smaller fragments that can be known as nanoplastics. So a microplastic is anything smaller than a pencil eraser, and a nanoplastic is anything smaller than about a grain of sand. And they can get down to the size of a virus, which means they are everywhere. And that is true. They are everywhere because as they get down to micro and nano levels, they get taken up by all of the cycles, all of the ecocycles wind up interacting with plastics and carrying them. So for instance, the hydrologic cycle. Plastic, as it breaks down in water bodies, you get tiny fragments in the water bodies, they evaporate with the water itself. So as they do so, they're hitching a ride into the clouds and into rain formation and snow formation and so on. And this is a microplastic filament on a snowflake. Now, this filament probably came off of a textile, and it could have been anything from a tablecloth to a fleece jacket, really anything at any time. And now it's going to hitch this ride all over the place. As a result of this kind of pervasiveness, investigators have found microplastics literally everywhere in the world they have ever searched for them, from the bottom of the Marianas Trench to the top of the highest mountains. They are absolutely everywhere. And they can be more prevalent in places like the Arctic, where wind currents carry them and then deposit them. So they move on wind. You get them a lot in dust, and anything that moves through the planet. Now, of course, if they're raining down, they're all over the fields and all over agriculture also. And we do have evidence that plants take up microplastics in their vasculature. This is a side cut of a wheat plant that's taken up microplastics, nanoplastics in its vasculature. We don't know a lot about this yet. Investigations are new. We do know that it depresses crop yields, which is pretty worrying. And we also know, now that we're looking, that soil basins actually contain about 23% more microplastics than ocean basins do, which is a surprise when we think about, well, the place that we started to note plastic pollution was the oceans. But it's actually on the land, so much so that it's more than that. And some of it comes from the practice of spreading sludge, sewer sludge, which is laden with microplastics, and also from practices like coating fertilizers and seeds in plastics. This is an extended release mechanism. So as the plastic gets brittle in the sun, it breaks down. the fertilizer or the seed is then released. That's the long release mechanism, but it leaves the microplastics in the soil. And we know that the soil itself is also damaged, that the microbiota, animals like worms that would be feeding in the soil, they're all impacted and all negatively impacted. So we know, okay, if it's in the air, it's in the water, it's in the food supply, not just the animals, but also in vegetable matter, it's going to be in us. And that is really what's caught people's attention in the last few years. And this is a New Yorker comic by Roz Chast, Flour, Sugar, Coffee, Tea, Microplastics. Because we don't have a solution to this yet. I'm not sure that there is a solution once microplastics are out there. Most people looking at this are saying, yeah, we need to do a lot more prevention because there's not a lot of cure. But the idea being like, if you can't do much about it, at least you can laugh at it. And there's an awful lot of microplastics humor actually floating around in memes on the web. But what does it mean if it's in us? Is it staying in us? How is it impacting us? It's estimated that we just pass about 90% of what we take in, because most of it, all right, we're eating it, we're drinking it, it's passing through our intestines and passing out. What we're breathing in, actually a lot of that is taken up and out through our lungs through natural mechanisms, but not all of it. 90% plus still leaves us with a disturbing quantity of plastic that is lingering in our bodies. And so the question over the last few years is, well, what happens when it lingers, if it's lingering? Philip Landrigan is one of the medical investigators who's been looking at plastic, and Phil cut his teeth on lead, not literally. But when he started his career in the 1970s, he was one of the investigators who was trying to demonstrate that lead, even at very, very low doses, was still a toxicant, that it's a neurotoxin, and that children were being overexposed to lead through things like leaded gasoline. And he used his findings to help push for the removal of lead from gasoline effectively. And then he looked at pesticides and so on. And in late years, he's been looking at plastics with the same lens, which is how I got to be able to work with him, which I'll get to in a sec. But he said one day, plastic pollution is visible everywhere, but it's also invisible everywhere as we begin to think about what it's doing. And I thought that's a really important comment, because as a medical historian, it reminds me an awful lot of the germ theory, where there are people in history who are advocating that there's animalcules and we're maybe passing them through our hands and we should be washing our hands, and they're getting laughed right out of the maternity ward. But once they became visible under a microscope, microbes became real to humans. And within 20 to 30 years of the visibility of the tuberculosis bacteria under the microscope, the entire planet had changed its hand hygiene practices. So this matters. This matters a lot as we start to think about the invisibility and look at them under a microscope and understand that they're everywhere. We have a moment where the public imagination has been fully captured. So carpe diem, let's make sure people understand what this is all about. So Phil, this is Phil up in the upper left, launched a study with some backing from the Minderoo Foundation of all of the known literature on plastics in human health. And it started out as 24 researchers from around the world working on pieces of this. And I had the privilege of being a part of this. By the end of 1 year, we were 48 totally exhausted researchers, and we put together one of the first major reports on the entire, it's a life cycle, but we don't like using the term life cycle because plastic has no end of life. So it's sort of a zombie cycle, but the cycle of plastics from manufacture through use and disposal and onward, and what the impacts are on humans. This was a really, really interesting thing to study and put me in a strange position of being able to answer questions that more people were asking every day because of the news cycles with microplastics. And the way that we looked at it on this report was, okay, well, the first thing we know is what's in plastic. What is plastic made of? And we can think about its components to think about its impacts on human. So it's made from carbon. In this case, fossil carbon. It's fundamentally a petrochemical product. But it's going to take you a while to get from a fossil carbon, an ethane gas, a methane gas, any kind of gas, or coal or oil, to a plastic fork, or this chapstick container. You're going to need a lot of additives to do the work of giving it the properties of smoothness and UV resistance and its color and so on. So you're going to have a lot of chemicals. And by a lot of chemicals, we mean a lot of chemicals. At the time of the Minderoo report, which came out in March of 2023, we'd identified 3,200 chemicals that were going into plastics. 1 year later, the PlastChem report had identified 16,325 chemicals in plastics. That's how fast the research is going. Now, why do investigators have to find this stuff out? Well, because there isn't disclosure required by any government entity for what's in plastics. Those are proprietary formulas. So the companies don't need to disclose. And the way that plastic is created, you have a lot of synthesis going on. In many cases, they don't actually know what's really in the plastic because of the chemical reactions that happen while it's being created. So what do we know about these 16,000 plus chemicals? Well, we know that 4,200 of them plus are hazardous. So 26% are outright hazardous. They're neurotoxicants, they're carcinogens, they're endocrine disruptors, and that is not in dispute. We know that some are less hazardous, about 7%. We know that most of them are entirely without data, period, full stop, never tested for safety. That's 66%. And less than 1% are regulated globally. So that's nervous making, and it was nervous making for the Minderoo team. And depending on who you asked, people like to ask, well, what's the scariest thing about plastic? And it was the unknown unknowns that Phil said were the most frightening thing to him. He made this slide, and I've always really liked it as a demo of like thinking about the plastic molecule. And I promise this is the only molecular slide I'll show you. But okay, the plastic backbone is carbon-carbon bonds. They're covalent, super hard to break, and that's why the stuff just doesn't break down. And then you've got your additives, and these are a few of the most well-known: phthalates, bisphenols, PFAS, brominated flame retardants. I'm not going to get into any of what they do to our bodies, but we can safely assume that all of these are on the do not eat list. You don't want to be imbibing these. And when they're added to the molecule, they're not necessarily bound. They're very loosely connected, or they're just sitting inside of the matrix of the molecule, which means that contrary to what we were led to believe about plastic, which is that it's stable and inert, it is not inert, because since these additives are not bonded, they leach out, they migrate at every point in the plastic life cycle, particularly when they're in direct contact with media like water and food and bodies. And this is particularly worrying to me now. As I look at this graph, we know that plastic production and chemical production are hand in glove. So if plastic is set to triple by 2060, so are chemical sales. And I was looking at this graph with a guy named Pete Myers, who you might have heard of. He's an endocrine scientist, and he actually coined the term endocrine disruption. And I said, Pete, when I look at this, the word unsurvivable actually comes to mind. But I feel like that's probably histrionic, right? Like that's probably saying too much. And he said, no, I think that's actually a kind way of putting it, because so many of these chemicals are endocrine disruptors, which I'll get to in just a sec what that means. But in the short term, what it means is if you take anything away from today's presentation, do not microwave any food or cook any food in plastic, because the most direct way to make those chemicals leach, those additives leach into your food, is to apply heat. At that point, that accelerates the process. So don't microwave it in plastic. If it says microwave safe, that actually refers to the plastic and not the food. It means that the plastic will not visibly denature in your microwave, but it says nothing about the contents of the food. So the second thing that we thought about on the Minderoo report was microplastics. And how does that shake out? Well, the model that investigators are thinking about at the moment is mostly as tiny Trojan horses. So on the one hand, you have the chemicals that are leaching into food and water, and we're drinking and eating those. But on the other hand, the microplastics that are lodged in the human body are acting like little Trojan horses because they are made of the additives. The additives aren't in the plastic. They are the plastic. They will never not be it. So as long as it's inside of you, it is constantly moving into the cells of your body or against the cells of your body. And given what those additives are, that tends to be pretty bad news for cells. Well, how bad is the news? We don't really know yet because it's hard to do in vivo experiments that are going to directly show you. But the in vitro experiments generally show you when you put plastics and plasticizers in a petri dish with live cells, they die. We've seen that over and over again. The other thing that we've seen over and over again is the animal models. We know very well that the animal models are directly affected by the chemicals and microplastics, and that they very directly develop medical problems. They develop health problems. We see them developing dementia. We see them developing cancers. We see them developing hormonal problems and fetal problems and so on. So that we knew. So as we're starting to look back, we're saying, okay, let's take a look at the animal models. Well, we see in zebrafish, for instance, that microplastics travel directly into the brain and also into the liver, and they cause these problems. And in mice in 2017, very similar findings. We see them displaying dementia when exposed to microplastics. On the Minderoo team, we said, you know, what happens in the animal models generally turns up in the human models later, but it's not later yet. So all we have is correlation, but let's keep an eye on it. So we've been keeping an eye on it, and so has a lot of the rest of the world. In 2021, this study came out finding evidence of microplastics in the human placenta. And this was alarming, not just because you're dealing with fetal development, but because the placenta was considered an impermeable barrier, protecting the fetus from anything that happened outside. So the microplastics are on both sides. They're on the fetal side and they're on the maternal side. And they're turning up in meconium, which is the first stool of a newborn infant. So as of 2021, January, we knew that they were crossing into places that were very uncomfortable. And when you looked at the medical studies and the lab studies, the animal studies at that point, we also had information about what it looked like in the animal studies. So, okay, we know that a pregnant person who has been breathing in microplastics, if that person in October 2020 is a rat doing the same thing, microplastics were located inside the offspring. And the offspring had lower rates of reproductive development. They had more birth defects. Like pretty much as you followed into the offspring and as it grew, you ran into more and more problems. So we knew as early as 2020 that the animal models were not looking so good. At this point, researchers are getting better and better funded and have more and more incentive to look for microplastics in the human body, and they start to look hard. So May 2021, lungs, meconium 2021, sputum, blood, breast milk, liver, urine, veins, testes and semen, heart tissue in August 2023, kidney, February 2024. I was actually at a convening with the Minderoo team in 2022 when the blood finding came out in the medical literature, and we all looked at each other. And it was nice to be able to do it in person. But we all looked at each other and said, okay, it's been documented in the human bloodstream. The other place that we knew to be nervous about it was the blood-brain barrier. Are the microplastics traveling into the human brain? Well, the next big finding was just this past March, New England Journal of Medicine. This one got a lot of attention, and you might have heard about it. This was a team of physicians that were following patients who had clogged arteries, basically. The carotid artery through the neck clogged. And so there's a fairly common procedure to unclog it. And for the non-medical people, it's a little bit like a Roto-Rooter. You pull the plaque out of the artery. So they followed more than 300 patients that had that arterial plaque, and they analyzed the plaque. And in 58% of the patients, they found nanoplastics in the plaque. And then they watched to see how the patients progressed over the next 36 months. And they found that in those patients who had nanoplastics in their plaque, there was a 450% increase in heart attack and stroke. So the outcomes for patients with microplastics in their carotid arteries were very definitively worse than for the other patients. Now, this is a single study. It needs to be replicated. And again, it's correlation. We don't have the causal mechanism specifically, but this was a very loud signal to those of us who were looking at these issues. I've heard Pete Myers say, like, if you happen to have a really good base of patients, like, please do this study again, because we need to know more about this finding. The next finding is the one that we were wondering about. And I think this actually might finally be out of preprint. It was published on the internet as a preprint in May. But this was the finding that we were waiting for about the blood-brain barrier. In this study, investigators looked at a series of cadavers who had died over a series of years, and they analyzed the brain tissue of those cadavers, but they also analyzed other organs. So they analyzed liver and kidney, and I think maybe a few others. And what they found was quite chilling. They found that the total plastics, yes, there were plastics in the brain, and that those concentrations increased enormously in recent years. Basically, as the background level of microplastics increases, so does the level of microplastics in the human brain by 50% on average. They found that polyethylene was the most common of the plastics. They found plenty. Polyethylene, that's from ethane. And that's what plastic bags and just very, very common single-use plastics are made of. The one that got even more chilling from my perspective, is this one. MNPs is what we call micro and nanoplastics, are selectively accumulated in the human brain, meaning they found more microplastics and nanoplastics there than they did in the liver and the kidneys. And what they're hypothesizing is that the human brain is very, very fatty. It's the fattiest tissue in the body aside from adipose tissue itself. And many of the additives in plastics are lipophilic, meaning they're attracted to fats. They dissolve into fats, they stay there. So the theory here is that the nanoplastics and microplastics are moving into the fattier tissue and accumulating there. And that's probably also why there were more of them in arterial plaque. And then lastly, they found that the brains of people who had had a history of Alzheimer's or dementia had between 5 and 10 times more microplastics than the healthier population. So this was all quite interesting and rather alarming. And again, it's a study that needs to be replicated. But even since this has come out, there have been more studies and more studies demonstrating microplastics in the brain and correlating them to Parkinsonian kind of symptoms, dementia symptoms, and so on. We consider those to be some of the mechanical impacts of microplastics in the body, at least insofar as we have a sense that they are literally gumming up the works. But again, it's actually the chemical impacts that investigators are the most concerned with. And those can come down to endocrine impacts, because an enormous quantity of these chemicals are what are called endocrine disruptors. They're chemicals that pose as hormones, they're confused as hormones, they disrupt the signaling system for the hormonal homeostasis of the human body. And we think of hormones, okay, testosterone, estrogen, androgen, like those are the fun ones. Start thinking about insulin. Think about human growth hormone. Our entire bodies are regulated by this feedback loop, this signaling system. So if it becomes disrupted, it disrupts everything everywhere. And cellular mechanisms basically use this amplification system of our hormones to function. And the tiniest doses are intensified by orders of magnitudes. So a very, very little bit goes a very, very long way. And it matters when it lands. When does it impact the body? The timing, not the dose, makes the poison with endocrine disruptors. And we understand quite well that the earlier, the worse. What happens in the womb doesn't stay in the womb. Those who are most negatively impacted by these types of chemicals are developing fetuses, newborn babies, and toddlers. Anything that is still laying down the neural pathways for its body, not the neural pathways, that's one of them, but in the developmental process is going to have trouble because the developmental process itself becomes misarranged. Here's an example. This is Pete Myers' slide. This is the mouse on the left is the healthy control mouse, and the mouse on the right was exposed to an endocrine disruptor. Actually, there's Pete right up there in the corner. It was exposed to an estrogen mimic, an estrogenergic endocrine disruptor as a fetus. And the mice that were born to this mother mouse, and mother mouse showed no impacts at all. The mice seemed fine on birth and they developed seemingly normally, at least to the basic eye. But as they got older, they developed more and more issues. And this particular mouse, at the time that it was sacrificed, its bladder was on the edge of exploding. What had happened here was that the tissue around the urethra had become constricted over time, and then so constricted that the mouse could barely pee, which caused its kidneys to become necrotic and its testes also effectively necrotic, and that was the impact on its bladder. So this causes us to take a look at the chronic disease cycle happening in the human population right now, and to start thinking much more carefully about what look like later life outcomes and how they may have been seeded and are continuing to be seeded during the fetal period, particularly as we start to see cancers in younger and younger patients, and as we start to see reproductive anomalies in younger and younger patients. I have a colleague who's an obstetrician who's starting to see in all of her patients, women who are in their 20s and early 30s who are otherwise healthy. She's seeing huge rates of gestational diabetes, of preeclampsia, things she never saw 8 years ago. So we're looking at this. As far as the brain is concerned, this is particularly worrying because the human brain develops kind of like a subway system or a train system. And I'm from New York City for much of my life. So this is the New York subway system. So if you imagine as the fetus is developing, it's creating neurons really rapidly and they're migrating to where they should be. And it's like laying down the track of the rail system. And if they don't wind up precisely where they need to be with their network of connections well secured, then the trains do not run efficiently on the tracks. It's an incredible process. If you study the neurodevelopment of a fetus, it creates it's called an exquisite vulnerability. And what we're seeing, of course, is a massive uptick in developmental disorders. We're seeing a massive uptick right now in autism, in ADHD, in all kinds of behavioral disorders. And we're seeing also that they tend to be gender linked, that autism, ADHD are far more prevalent in males than females. There is a hormonal component in human development that seems to, for the females, possibly protect. But that this is happening is undeniable. And again, as I said, it causes us to re-examine the chronic disease burden just in general, because all of these things, neurological disorders, cardiovascular diseases, neoplasms, diabetes, kidney diseases, all of these have endocrine components. Now, it's easy for me to start to feel like a snake oil salesman after not too long when I'm like, you got a problem, endocrine disruptor. You've got a problem, endocrine disruptor. But we're thinking about human development and about a change that has happened since the 1950s, since the petrochemical era changed the way in which our society deals with the synthetic chemicals. We have more and more and more of them, and we have a changing disease rate, even when controlled for age and survival, that is moving up along with some background factor. We know this cannot possibly be genetic because the changes are happening faster than evolution could possibly happen. This is something environmental. So there is great concern that it's chemical exposure. And here's just one more. This is sperm count has been declining since the 1970s. That decline is accelerating globally. In the United States, it's about 1% per year. So thus far, that's not really a problem because we're looking at the hundreds of thousands. But there's concern here, and there's also concern as you look at women's reproductive problems. Those are also escalating in younger and younger patients. So Okay, changing gears just slightly, because this is a CCL gathering, I want to point out how much of this is also a climate problem. Because plastics are largely sourced, 99% of them are sourced in fossil carbon. And okay, climate crisis, here we go. If plastic were a country, it would be the world's fifth largest greenhouse gas emitter, just ahead of Brazil. And you can count those emissions from all kinds of places, from the extraction process, from the manufacture process. It takes about a quarter of a bottle of water. If it were a quarter full of petroleum, that's the footprint of what it took to make that bottle of water and transport it to market. So very, very heavy greenhouse gas impact. And of course, at this point, there's really not a lot of doubt among people who look at evidence and facts about what's going on. The climate crisis is here. This past winter is one of the warmest on records, despite our cold snaps, which are happening because of the loosening of the oh my gosh, you guys can all think of the word, the Gulf Stream. Last winter was the warmest ever on record, and last summer we had 7 consecutive days of the hottest temperatures the planet had ever seen. So they were the hot or in recorded history, and also pre-recorded history. Looking at the fossil record, we're able to deduce that those were the hottest temperatures in the last 125,000 years. So the planet is now warmer than the human species has recently evolved to live on. There is a tiny ray of good news in there, which is that as this happens and becomes more undeniable, people are moving over to renewable energy faster and faster. And we can't move fast enough, but what the heck, we're moving pretty fast. EV sales in 2023 were 30% of the entire market. As of this year, renewable energy has outstripped coal as a source of energy worldwide. So there are bright spots here. Particularly that for us, not so bright if you happen to be a fossil fuel producer, in which case you're looking at your margin going down because you want to bring it out of the ground, you want to be able to sell it. You're not going to be able to sell it so well as a fuel. And this is something that industry knew and understood decades ago, and which is behind that hockey stick curve of plastic production. There has been a pivot from Plan A, which is to use fossil carbon for fuel, to Plan B, which is fossil carbon for plastics. That is why they are projecting such an increase in plastic. And to think about it just a little bit more, given where we need to be to meet any kind of climate goal, we cannot not account for plastic. If plastic production continues as planned right now, plastics by themselves can account for 25 to 31% of the total carbon budget that we have. We can't afford that. Under business as usual, that's a huge part of the carbon budget. We will not be able to keep to our climate goals if those industry goals are met. Decarbonizing the power grid is not going to be enough to reach the climate goals if we continue to produce plastics the way we do now. So what are we going to do? Well, there's a lot of things we can do. In our private lives right now, it feels more hopeful because that's where we have the most power. I don't know. I finally just said goodbye to meat eating. I like meat, but it's time to become a vegetarian for me. Personally, I got there. But there are other things that we can do. It's going to be hard to influence legislation in the next 2 years, but we can socialize what we understand about plastics and health more and more. The more people understand this, the more they get kind of an ick factor around food packaged in plastic, around the fact of plastic itself. And it causes people to push back against purchasing, against supporting, against being part of the plastic cycle. So information that you can socialize, for instance, about the impact of plastics and plastic packaging on food, this gets people right where they live. Okay, we talked about you don't want chemical migration through high temperatures, but other things that will impact chemical migration from packaging into food are long contact times. How long has that food been standing in the plastic bottle in the pantry? Also, Small portion sizes are actually worse than larger portion sizes because there's more surface to volume ratio there. So you have more of an opportunity for the chemicals to migrate into the food. And then what's in the food is very important. Fat soluble chemicals are going to move into fatty foods, which is important when you think about yogurt, about milk, about meat, about cheese. All of those things are packaged in plastic. So as people understand this and they begin to realize how unavoidable plastic is, they start to demand solutions. So that's an important part also. And you can kind of point out, like, look, once you see it, you can't unsee it. How much of our industrial food chain is packaged in plastic, but it doesn't need to be. And this is one of those like historical truisms. It became this way because it widened the profit margin for the food industry. But there are other ways to package foods: cardboard, glass, metals. So moving back over toward those kinds of food, we don't need a moonshot new material. We don't have to make some new plastic out of seaweed or out of mushrooms. We can move over to packaging that we already have right at our fingertips. So those are other messages. And if you're looking for allies in the plastics fight, there are a ton of them. This is just a handful of some of the very effective allies in this fight. Third Act, NRDC, Gaia, Surfrider, Just Zero. It goes on and on. There are a great number of organizations that are plugged into this fight. But the most important part of the fight is the hardest part for the next couple of years, at least federally. So we have our localities to think about, our towns, our villages, our cities, where it's still possible to push for change. And that change, the best kind, is going to be regulatory. They're the most efficient and they're also the most just because they don't demand that people without a lot of extra money spend more money on the more expensive but safer packaging. We need to turn off the plastic tap. We need to push for policies that put caps on plastic production, that demand the removal of some of the most toxic chemicals from plastic, because frankly, they don't need to be there, and they're not there in most European packaging. They were banned by the Stockholm Convention years ago. So there are alternative ways to produce even basic plastics. So any kind of a law that pushes for that is a good thing, right down to bag bans. Another piece of good news is that the public is with us globally and also the American public. Globally, about 80% of people support regulations on single-use plastics or plastics in general. And in the United States, it's 79% of voters across the political spectrum. They're concerned about plastic pollution. And when they understand what can be done, they support policies that reduce single-use plastic. Now, single-use plastic is the one that we go after the most because it's the low-hanging fruit. It's what Philip Landrigan calls the stupid plastic, the stuff we didn't really have that much of before the year 2000, and we have literally tons of now, especially after COVID, when everything is wrapped in plastic for health reasons that never checked out in the first place. This is a very simple kind of policy that is on the march nationwide, which is the bag ban, a bag ordinance. 12 states and over 500 cities and towns have a plastic bag ordinance. The idea in pushing for these is they're fairly simple to pass. There's an enormous amount of data showing that they reduce litter by 33%. They instill different kinds of habits. People kick and moan, and by people, it's actually often trade associations, and say this is impossible, it's an imposition. But in the places where bag bans have been implemented, there is usually a 1 or 2 day kind of like coughing period during which people can't quite remember that this has happened, and then they just start bringing their own bags, and it becomes quite normal very fast. So that's one that's easy to push for. So that's the health presentation, and I wanted to just put a little plug in for my class, which Lori mentioned. It runs through Bennington College. It's open to all auditors, anyone, anywhere. We go into all of this stuff in great detail. It's 2 hours basically on the East Coast, 7 to 9 p.m. on Wednesdays, 7 weeks from April 16th to May 28th. This is the link. It's a long guy, admissions.bennington.edu/register/microplastics human health. I can ask Lori and Rob to forward it out along with the recording of this, make it available. Or you can just email me. My email is pretty simple right now because I don't have my my PSNAP email in place yet. It's just MJW, Megan Joy Wolff 132 at Gmail. So you can email me with any questions about this presentation or to find out about how to register for the course. So I'll stop share. Whew, okay, questions?
So Megan, that was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll just open it up. If people have questions, just unmute yourself, maybe raise your hand so we can do it in an orderly fashion. Go for it.
You didn't say anything about recycling plastics. Is recycling the practical way to deal with this?
No, we were taught that it is, but it's not, because plastic is not inert. So if you recycle a plastic and it's made out of all of these chemical additives, first of all, very few plastics are actually recyclable. They were not designed to be. Plastics recycling was only introduced in 1988 in response to pushback from consumers who were concerned about the garbage crisis and didn't feel comfortable purchasing single-use plastics. So industry took a look at the drawing board and said, hey, 1 and 2s, resin codes 1 and 2, some of those plastics can be melted down and reconstituted. But the diversity of different kinds of chemicals, things melt at a different point, they're different colors, they have too many different properties. So what we've been taught to recycle is mostly not recyclable in the first place. When it is recycled, it has a very limited span. Most of it is just goo once it's been melted down. So you need to introduce another suite of additives. So you got garbage in, and then you added more garbage. So recycled plastic has no business ever being in contact with food. A great deal of what goes into our plastic recycling bins winds up being incinerated or landfilled, or it's shipped overseas where waste pickers go through it to try to find the recyclable items, and then the rest is dumped or incinerated, and that's actually how a lot of it gets into the ocean. But basically, plastic recycling, it's not that it was a failure, it was a lie. And it's quite well documented. I can send you out articles through NPR and other news outlets that have gotten into the archives of industry, and they have it right there that it was never a thing. But it did distract us. It does what it was intended to do. It makes us feel like it's safe and great to buy plastic because, it's going to get recycled, and that's great. So sorry to be the bearer of bad news on that one. Certainly my trash basket, since I've started thinking hard about this stuff, it looks like 1988 in there again. All the things that I'd gotten into the habit of recycling, they're back there in the trash, which is a good reminder, honestly, as I shop to, spend a little more money on the glass, which I've personally found is like, now that I understand the chemical migration, I'm like, I am going to buy that glass thing. Thank you. I don't mind as much spending the money. But those are my personal choices. And again, I have the luxury to make them. So the regulatory change is the one that strikes the most people. I see Daniela's hand, and then I see Bob's hand, and then I see Jay's hand. So let's start with Daniela.
Yeah, just two things. One is a clarification and the other is a question. Clarification, plastic bags, that it started with an M and there was 3 letters. Is this what's when you store your food, or is it only if you heat your food in one of these that then you're potentially putting the plastics in your brain? Whatever. So I'm like, oh, I thought this was inert. So can you talk a little bit about plastic bags? And the other is 2 slides talked about an uptick in the last 8 years. So can you talk about the 8-year thing? Okay.
Sure, absolutely. Those are great questions. So plastic is stable, but it's not inert. No plastic is inert. So those chemicals, the additives that make the plasticizers, migrate constantly. And we think about like that plastic bag, we think about it in terms of what we call food contact materials. So if it's in contact with food, that's where we start to get nervous about the chemical migration. And you can think about what you're touching and what's, dermal. We don't have a lot of very fixed evidence about what happens dermally, but any food that's in that bag, if it's fatty, if it's a dairy thing, if it's touching the plastic, there's going to be migration. The colder temperature will slow that migration, but if it's been in there for a long time, you have more migration. If you stick it in the microwave or it's in your hot car, you'll get more migration. and so on. And so that counts for things like Tupperware. It counts for the whole suite of plastic items. There is an alternative, which is silicone, like food grade silicone. That's a reasonable alternative, but we've seen this film before. We know that it is more inert than normal plastic, but you're still looking at a lot of plasticizers, and they're not entirely inert. So my mother went out and bought, dozens and dozens of stasher bags for everyone in the family. Like, that was really nice of her, but then my dad likes to nuke all the food in the stasher bag, and like, no, it's not inert enough to trust that way. So the best thing for food is to just try to move off of the plastic as you can. And also, by the way, I should have said this at the top. None of you are personally responsible for this. This is a structural problem. So you should check your plastics guilt at the door, and also check your panic, because you can't do anything if you're panicked. So finding the ways that you can make changes and making those changes sanely, rather than, turning over the whole kitchen and everything, is the way to go about it. Slow and steady, and just be conscious as you make choices going forward. So, and the 8 years. So that's about the background level of microplastics. Like, if you look at that curve of how much plastic is being produced, it's 1-to-1 production and pollution. And so pollution is not just the Coca-Cola bottle floating around in the ocean. Pollution is, when you think about microplastics, think about plastic as sort of like human skin. It's constantly shedding cells. So plastic is always shedding microplastic. The more plastic we have, the more microplastic we have. And that is why we think we're seeing this uptick recently, because we have so much more plastic. So background is foreground. Bob, and then Jay, and then Curtis.
Megan, when you showed the map of states that have bag bans, you had green and purple colors for the states. So what was the significance of the colors?
I think the purple ones were statewide bans, and the other ones were county and citywide bans. There are a number of states that have what we call bans on bans. They're preemptive. They were introduced by industry as a way of keeping localities from being able to regulate single-use plastic. And there are more than 20 states that have those. So you don't see any bans in those states. One of them is Montana. And a group called the Cottonwood Law Center, Environmental Center, sued in Montana on constitutional grounds and said, you can't take away our right as citizens to self-regulate. And they won. And so then Bozeman passed a bag ordinance, and then the court basically has stalled it and said, no, we need to re-examine this, and we're upholding the ban on bans for now. Colorado also managed to vote out its ban on bans. But that's why you're getting the patchwork. The idea strategically is, once you have enough states that have bans, it becomes possible on a federal level, because you can say, look, the American people like this, they want it, and it's been successful in all of these locations. So that's what we're pushing for.
Okay, thank you. I was going to ask, have you
yeah.
seen the movie The Graduate?
Oh, yes. Yes.
So I know there's no room for humor in this subject, but I think back to Mr. Robinson telling Benjamin, I have one word for you.
Yep.
Plastics.
Yep. Actually, in my other presentations, I talk about the creation of disposable plastics and the single-use plastic, and that was an industry idea. And the slogan there was, the future of plastic is in the garbage can. If you can get people to throw away their plastics and just keep buying new plastic, you have a very promising future. And they did. Jay.
Yeah, I just want to add, and this is an area I've got a little bit expertise in. I used to be EPA's national expert on circularity packaging.
Oh, wow.
So I want to add a couple of other pieces to this. That policy in the 2000s, 2010s accelerated this as well, because we were all focused on greenhouse gas reduction, and the petroleum industry used plastics and the lightweighting of packaging as the reason to say we're generating less greenhouse gas emissions, even if it wasn't recyclable. And that's when they started pushing out this multi-layer laminate packaging that we're starting to see now throughout the marketplace.
Right.
So, just kind of know that up front. Bag bans, to be honest with you, the petroleum industry is actually okay with bag bans because they can go fight that one-on-one. And, just so you know, within U.S. solid waste laws, it's unlikely in the way the laws, were originally crafted and written that Congress will actually take on a bag policy itself. But what I do think they are talking about is extended producer responsibility frameworks, the whole industry accountable for that, and including things like TSCA to make sure the additives that are being put in actually get looked at on the front end versus on the backside for government to go find it. And then the last thing is, while everyone is talking about bag bans, what the American Chemistry Council and the Plastics Industry Association is really doing is going around and changing laws in states for chemical recycling so that you can claim that if you just look at it at end of life and you can, quote, recycle it chemically, then you can make it circular, and therefore we can produce, and we ought to be producing as much of this stuff as we can. I will tell you, at least 25 states have passed laws that benefit that. So it's something we ought to be looking at. If you see the word molecular recycling, chemical recycling, anything like that, I can tell you it is not recycling. If anything else, it's to put a green stamp on it so that you can produce and move the 35% of petroleum for transportation as we electrify into the production of plastics. So just keep your eyes on that. If you see it, it's not a good thing.
Yep, every word he just said is exactly on. I'm in the middle of offboarding from a group called Beyond Plastics. I've been their health policy director for 3 years, and that one's run by Judith Enck, who's also former EPA. And she's got she is laser focused on chemical recycling as laws are passed to allow it and enable it. And also actually EPR, which that's part of the class. Sign up for the class. My shorthand for EPR is you make it, you take it. So it holds the manufacturers accountable for what they're producing.
Yeah, me and Judith know each other really well. So.
Okay, there you go. Yep. Curtis.
Yeah, thanks. This problem is not going to be solved unless it's solved by a collective group of people. And using technology, I guess, that probably doesn't exist at this point. However, we do have a personal thing that we should be doing as well. And so if I was to embark on a mission to reduce this personally and wanted to ask other people or tell other people who might ask me how I'm doing it, who are the brave souls that have actually pushed as much plastic out of their life, that they on their day-to-day living? And do you have a list of these brave souls? Because that's what I teach in a healthcare and climate change course, and one of the students last year in this course attempted to address this problem. Could you do it on an individual basis? And her conclusion was, no, you can't. And so, but by the same token, there are some people who have been relatively successful. And my question is, do you have a list? And is their findings, which I guess we could perhaps look at, available?
I don't have a specific list, but I do have one book I'm very fond of. Eve Schaub is a colleague of mine. She's a writer and a humorist, and I will recommend this because someone mentioned there's not a lot of humor in this story, right? So Eve is a humorist, and she decided to try to go for an entire year without generating trash. And she got, 2 weeks in and discovered that she could not avoid plastic. So she enrolled for Judith Enck's course on plastic pollution and learned everything she could about plastic and the life cycle of plastics. And she continued her year of trying to live with no plastic or as little plastic as she possibly could. And that was her focus. She's a very intelligent woman. So the story, the book is a very humorous chronicle of the plastic piling up in the kitchen and, the whack-a-mole and the attempts to follow all of the recycling symbols and, learning where the greenwashing was and, that, yes, this says recyclable, but it's only recyclable on Mars in, 2073 or, that kind of a thing. So while I can't give you a solid list, there are influencers who do it and try to post online. Like, look, I only made this one jar of garbage for my entire year. But this book really gets to the point that it's not garbage is not the problem anymore. Plastic garbage is the problem. So yeah, hopefully that'll take you somewhere. Most people that I know who are normal human beings and don't write hilarious books about this start in their kitchens. And their shopping habits move over to, more co-ops and health food stores and places where they're not getting everything in a bag, automatically packaged in a bag. And it goes from like the sort of standard to the sublime of how into it you're going to try to be. A friend gave me a bread maker and I'm like, yay, now I won't buy bread in plastic bags, until another friend pointed out that it's lined with PFAS. Oh, right. It's whack-a-mole every which way you do it. So my other piece of advice, find the pieces that you're comfortable reducing that are sensical in your life. And then you can actually provide a pretty strong example just by doing those things, even without proselytizing. So like I carry little metal containers around in my car and I drive an EV, yay, but that was new. I got pushed to my limit recently and was like, oh my God, I'm killing everything. Here's my EV. I carry them around in my car for when I have leftovers. And then I scrape my leftovers into my little metal tin. And the other people at the table are like, what are you doing? And I'm like, hey, look, it's a little metal tin. I don't have a plastic thing now. And then they get a little metal tin. And then somebody else does, and so on. So, I mean, they're not making giant waves of change, but it helps. Bill McKibben says, in this fight, to win slowly is to lose, and he's not wrong, but it helps. And socializing the ideas helps a lot.
Okay.
Daniela.
Let me interrupt
Go
here, because Megan, at CCL, we try to be very cognizant of people's time, and we have gone
Okay.
over. So I think we need to I would say call it quits.
Okay.
But I guess I can leave it up to you. But I actually would like to at least, Daniela, if I may, I'm going to let Paul ask a question because he had several questions in the chat that didn't get answered. So you had your chance, with all due respect. Let's let Paul ask a question and then we'll call it. Is that okay?
Thanks very much.
Yep.
I'm on a California state advisory group on wastewater planning. And wastewater captures fibers from synthetic clothing, whether it's washed at home or at nursing homes or whatever. That the wastewater is then full of microfibers. Most of that, the research says, gets caught in the sludge. That the procedures do in fact capture it in this sludge. They have flocculants and so forth to settle it out. That sludge, however, is put on farmers' fields. Otherwise, you would be using artificial nitrogen. And I haven't heard you could landfill the sludge, but if you burn it, then you've got the fumes. So if you have any ideas about what to do with sludge or how to get the microplastics out of the sludge, I mean, the same thing applies with other toxics, but there's no rules now. And it is, I can and do avoid synthetic clothing, but economy-wide, we're not doing that, and we really can't. And so there's going to be a huge amount of synthetic fibers in the sewage sludge. It is collected. It doesn't have to go back in the wild, but it currently goes in the wild. And then the similar question, what about car tires? Have any solutions there?
Yeah, those are really astute questions. Sorry, I hadn't even noticed your hand. I was just looking at my screen. That was a bad bias of mine. So with sludge, there is no easy answer. And you're right, there's a whole lot of other toxicants that are in the sludge. With filtering microplastics, it is possible to filter out microplastics. The problem is they keep going down to nanoplastics. And it's the nanoplastics that move into the human body. They're the ones that are able to cross through the intestinal lining and the lung alveoli and so on. So, you know, it's harm reduction to have microplastic filters on wastewater. And I think it's a good move. And frankly, harm reduction is a great way to go. And California in particular is actually monitoring now for microplastics and is ahead of most of the rest of the country in thinking about water and microplastics. So that's a good part of it. You know, sludge itself is such a layered problem that I don't have the answers for that one beyond the whack-a-mole of like, we got to ban PFAS, we got to do this, we got to do that, because waste will always be with us, like death and taxes. Everybody poops. So, the second one that you mentioned was
Tires. Car tires.
Tires.
Car and bicycle tires, for that matter.
Yeah, and that's a nightmare. Quite a lot of microplastics are actually made from the dust that comes from our tires wearing down. There are ways to re-engineer even car tires. There is research going into that. I'm not privy to where it stands right now. There are mechanisms that individual inventor types have tried to create that can try to capture the dust as it comes off the tire. Limited success there. Driving more slowly reduces the amount of tire particles. So I believe that there was a Scandinavian country that did try to implement speed limits based on that. But you can imagine how popular that is. You know, even myself, when I'm, you know, late for X or Y and I'm like, oh, you know, I have to get there. Oh no, tire dust. Okay, that's not really what I'm most worried about, right? So that's a really big question. And you know, we know that this stuff is not innocuous, that it's not just dust. It's if you've been following coho salmon, there's a major salmon collapse, and it was discovered that it had to do with one of the chemicals that was in the car tires, because they are actually they're a polymer. Anything that you think right now is rubber is probably a plastic polymer. So Paul, you have your finger on a couple of the biggest problems out there, and you know, there are piecemeal solutions right now, but no major ones, I'm afraid.
Okay.
I did drop in the
thank you.
chat my email address.
Yep.
All of you are welcome to email me with follow-up questions, and I also dropped in the link to my class. So if you want to hear me talk ad infinitum for 7 weeks in a row and get to know me better, particularly if you're interested in joining the Physicians Network, or you're a researcher or a healthcare provider of any stripe, get in touch, take the class. My goal here is to network as many powerful voices as we can get out there, talking to legislators, talking to medical societies, talking to patients, talking to whomever is going to listen when you come in and say, hey, I have some really credible knowledge here. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
Thank
Megan,
you.
and we certainly appreciate it. It's been superb. So,
Okay,
and thank
great.
you, everybody.
Super. Thanks so much.
And Megan,
Okay.
will we be able to share your slides?
Yeah, I'll email them to you. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good.
Great. Okay.
All right, everybody.
Great. Good night, everyone.
Everybody have a good night.